Week 3, we're going over chapters 3 and 4. But before we do that, I'm just going to pray us in. So join me in prayer. Father God, we just thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for gathering all of us over here safely. All the discussion that we're going to have, Holy Spirit, may you just reveal yourself to us however you may. And so we lift this up to you. May you speak through Chief Hahn, and we give you thanks. We lift this up to you in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Is it on now? Oh, figures it's my fault. All right, so good evening. How's everyone doing? Wow, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start tonight with just reading like 3 different partial paragraphs in his book to kick us off tonight. But again, think about these things that Martin Luther King is talking about, not only from the time he's talking in the 60s, the mid to late 60s, but also in our day today. Some things have changed, some things have remained the same, I would think, that you'll probably come away with. So I'm going to start. So if you have a book like mine, which I realize now not everybody's books have the same page, if you go to, it's really the first page of chapter 3, the bottom of the first page, which in my book it's page 71. So he writes, it would be neither true nor honest to say that the Negro's status is what it is because he is innately inferior, or because he is basically lazy and listless, or because he has not sought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. To find origins of the Negro problem, we must turn to the white man's problem. As Earl Conrad says in his recent book, I have sought out these new routes in the unshakable conviction that the question involved there cannot be and never could be answered merely by examining the Negro himself, his ghettos, his history, his personality, his culture. For the answer to how the Negro status came to be what it is does not lie essentially in the world of the Negro, but in the world of the white. And he talks about guilt here, and I think on the first night I said, to me, history, there's no place for guilt because it's past. There's nothing you can do to change it. So the next one I'd like to read is page 77. I don't know what it is in your book. Short paragraph where Martin Luther King says, and so, with the growth of slavery, men had to convince themselves that a system which was so economically profitable was morally justifiable. The attempt to give moral sanction to a profitable system gave birth to the doctrine of white supremacy. So I don't know how many people know this. I imagine several do. But our country became a world economic power initially, for the first time, through cotton. And we sold most of the world's cotton, a lot of it to Europe where they made clothes and things. The engine of cotton was slavery. So what Martin Luther King is talking about is the racial inferiority of many groups, but in this case of African Americans, was profitable. And so we had to come up with ways that justified putting one group down so we could make a huge profit. And we'll talk about more of that in a second. And the last one before we jump in is on the very next page, where Martin Luther King writes, a whole school of racial ethnologists developed using such terms as species, genus, and race. It became fashionable to think of the slave as a species of property. It was during this period that the word race came into fashion. And he talks about Dr. Samuel Morton, which we'll talk about in a second. A Philadelphia physician emerged with the head size theory, which affirmed that the larger the skull, the superior, and we'll talk about that in a second. And he also talks a little bit in the next sentence, Dr. Josiah Nott, who whose pseudo-scientific evidence to prove that the black man was little above the level of apes. So, raise your hand if you've heard black people called apes before. Monkeys, gorillas, animals in general, jungle bunnies, those kind of terms that are kind of animal terms. So, let's talk a little bit about why Martin Luther King talks about that. So, in addition to those that we'll talk about in a second, but the church played a large role in this too. So you think about 250 years plus of slavery. How does something last that long? I think in the first session I said I was not a fan of history in high school, just like I wasn't a fan of many of my classes. But I did wonder, how did something that horrific last for so long? Because in today's age, if you're upset about something, you're protesting in front of somebody's house, you're protesting in the middle of the street. Like, how did those things not happen for 250 years, or at least to the point to where people really noticed a lot? Well, I'll tell you, like a lot of the primary churches, a lot of the popular churches, and I'm not talking about the one-offs that nobody listened to, but in churches, the pastors would preach that God made black people for slavery. And any resistance to that was not only bad to the slave owner, but it was going against God. So you think about people that are going to church, and if you heard that from this stage, that's going to influence a lot of people. But Martin Luther King talked about Samuel Morton, but even before Samuel Morton, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a British surgeon named Charles White. He declared that each race, and I might add that these doctors and scientists that I'm talking about are not like the snake oil salesmen that come into town and sell you this little liquid that's going to cure all your ills. It's like anybody notice in the sports, like basketball, football, there's all these medication commercials. And at the end they go, this could cause... And then they talk for like 20 minutes about all the things. Years ago, my daughter was watching football with me, and she said, man, that causes more problems than it's solving. So I'm not talking about those snake oil salesmen. I'm talking about well-respected doctors and scientists that would then print in national medical journals that people read, and like that's like the Bible in the medical field, right? We're reading these journals by these very renowned doctors and scientists. So Charles White, a surgeon, British surgeon, said that he declared that races were separate species, divinely created with specific immutable traits. Europeans were farthest removed from the brute creation, and Africans occupied the lowest rung, a bare step above monkeys and apes. And many doctors and scientists would do studies on race, and they would conclude that Africans were the lowest of all and always closest to the animal kingdom. And many of them would write, they are similar to monkeys or apes. So that's where those terms come from. In the book, he talked about Samuel Morton. So in the 1820s and 1830s, Samuel Morton collected about 1,000 skulls from all over the world of different races. And I know this sounds crazy, at least it sounds crazy to me, so I hope it sounds crazy to you. This was his scientific study. He poured lead pellets into the skulls, essentially to see how large each skull was. And the larger the skull, then the smarter that race is, according to Samuel Morton. So he poured all these lead pellets into all these different skulls, and he concluded this. He concluded the biggest brains belonged to the Europeans. Shocker. With English at the top of the heap, he said Caucasians were distinguished by the highest intellectual endowments. He said Native Americans were slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war, from pouring lead pellets into Native American skulls. Why do you think he would say Native Americans were fond of war at this time? You think there's another reason why he might want to say something like that? Right, we're fighting with Native Americans because they're fond of war. We have no choice. They're fond of war. Yes, I think somebody had their hand up here at the middle table. I don't think he did that. Some people might have wished he did. And he concluded that Africans were joyous, flexible, lazy, and represented the lowest grade of humanity. And I mentioned in the last sentence of the second page I read, they talked about Joseph Knott. Joseph Knott was a surgeon and an anthropologist. He believed that slavery, he owned slaves, by the way. He believed that slavery was the natural condition of blacks and pledged to resist all encroachment on our constitutional and natural rights to slave ownership. Constitutional and natural rights to slave ownership. So we might say, oh, that's great. That all ended with slavery. That was all to justify slavery. But in the book, Martin Luther King often talks about we write these laws down, but we don't address any, like the root causes of how we got there, right? So we just wrote it like ink on a piece of paper, but we didn't address the belief system, the things we were taught, the things that we were taught, that these doctors taught us, that these scientists taught us, that the pastors in the churches taught us about the inferiority of people like Native Americans and African Americans and Chinese and all these different groups. But it continued long after that. Raise your hand if you've heard of eugenics. So raise your hand if you knew California was one of the leaders in eugenics. So a few less. So I was on a panel one time with an ethnic studies professor from Sac State. And I didn't know she was going to be on the panel with me. So it was kind of a surprise, I think, from the organizers of the panel, not by her, but by the organizers of the panel. And at some point in there, I was still working at the time as police chief. She said all police officers, all law enforcement, not just police officers, but everybody that works in law enforcement is racist. And clearly I don't agree with that. But she said the reason for that is because law enforcement's history is filled with racism. And so therefore the training is racist, the academies are racist, the laws are racist, the policies are racist, on and on and on and on and on. Now what she said was true. I can give you a lot of history in law enforcement that has racism baked in. But I also believe that with good people and good leadership, that organizations evolve. And I think we've come a long way, not just law enforcement, but as a country, and I think we still have a long way to go. So I asked this question, so I'm going to ask you, and this is pertaining to eugenics, if you couldn't tell. Does anybody know who is considered the founding, and if anybody's from Sac State in here, then you're disqualified to answer this. Does anybody know who the founding father, who's considered the founding father of Sacramento State University? That was founded after World War II, by the way. Nobody? Has anybody, raise your hand if you know who Charles Gady is. 1, 2, 3. So we used to have a Gady, for those of you that have been in Sacramento for a while, we used to have a Gady Middle School named after Charles Gady. We used to have a Gady Park out in Sacramento County named after Charles Gady. We still have a Gady Road. Ironically, it's where a lot of the state offices, CDCR is out in Rancho Cordova. The school is now named Rosa Parks Middle School, and I don't remember what we changed the park name to. But Charles Gady was a eugenist. And he was the leader of the Northern California Eugenics Society. I don't remember the specific name, but it was something like that. He was a devout racist. But eugenics not only believed in the superiority of race, but they also believed other things. They believed that criminality was genetic. They believed that disabilities were genetic. And they believed that you could sterilize people to create a more perfect race. So if you were deaf, if you were blind, if you had some physical disability, like, maybe you were born with one leg shorter than the other, or, some physical disability, they believed that if possible, we should sterilize you, men and women, so you couldn't have more children, because then they would be defective. They also believed that about criminality or mental illness. If you had mental illness, we should sterilize you, because your kids will have mental illness. If you're in prison right now because you burglarized some homes, we should sterilize you because your kids will burglarize homes. And so that led to the eugenics laws, or the sterilization laws, that we were the second state in the country to pass sterilization laws in 1909. And it lasted into the 2000s that we sterilized people in state institutions, state prisons. We sterilized over 20,000 people in California in state institutions. we were the state with the most sterilizations by far. The next closest was Virginia with 8,000. So the Nazis in World War II, Hitler, the California Eugenics Society wrote a book on their beliefs and how to do all this. The Nazis got that book, and that was the foundation of their genocide and their sterilization program was California. So these beliefs that, about superiority of race were expanded upon by the eugenics folks to include disabilities, criminal behavior, and the inferiority of people. And it might not surprise you that the people that were statistically sterilized the most were Hispanic women. And most of the people in our state institutions, not most, I think it was, who knows how accurate this is, but at least like 30+% were sterilized against their will. Another large percentage were sterilized and didn't know they were being sterilized. Like I'm in prison, I'm going in for surgery for gallbladder surgery. And while they're doing that surgery, they sterilized me. And there's a documentary. I have not seen the documentary. I don't know. It might be on Netflix. But they did a documentary on the sterilization, and there's a few people still alive that were sterilized, so they interviewed them. I have not seen it yet. But so these beliefs continued on in other ramifications. And so I want to give you, so back up a little bit. So Martin Luther King is talking about, like, it's not there's reasons why we do the things that we've done to certain groups of people. And if we don't address those things, they will continue. So, I'm supposed to point it this way. So, we'll get to this in a second. But how many people have ever heard of the Coon Chicken Inn restaurant? Has anybody ever heard of that before? How many people, okay, don't look real close at my pictures on there yet. How many people, if you were to guess where the Coon Chicken Inn was in the United States, where would you think it was? Somebody said South Alabama. That's what I would think too. Because, terms like coon, Sambo, Aunt Jemima, Mammy, all those are slave terms. Those all came about during slavery to reinforce the stereotype of groups of people. So if you think about, if we dehumanize a whole group of people, it makes it easier for us to do certain things to them. So who do you think we dehumanize today? Immigrants? Transgender? Women? That, to me, that's one of the bigger ones, right? Like, even well-meaning people, I think, dehumanize people in prison, right? And if we dehumanize them, then what are we going to do to try to ensure that when they come out into our communities that they have the best chance of being productive and all that? Probably not as much if we've already dehumanized them. So the reason why I love using Coon Chicken Inn is before I did history research, I had never heard of such a thing. And this was not in the South. So the term coon came up during slavery. It initially meant lazy, would be violent if provoked, those sort of things. And so, like, slavery was good for this group of people because they can't survive on their own. So the Coon Chicken Inn started in Salt Lake City, Utah, in 1925. Founded by a couple, Lester Graham and his wife, Addie. It opened in Salt Lake City in 1925. It closed in 1957. It opened in Seattle in 1929, closed in 1949. It opened in Portland in 1930 and closed in 1949. I don't know how well you can see it, but on the top picture, you see the big, that's supposed to represent a coon. It's really a train porter. Where'd it go? Where the gap in the teeth is in the front, that's the front door to the restaurant. So you walk, that's a door that you'd open to go into the restaurant, just so you get a good picture of it. So the stereotypical black man with coal black skin, huge red lips, oversized teeth, porter cap appeared on menus, placemats, plates, cups, bowls, toothpick holders, matchbox, newspaper ads. The Seattle Times ran newspaper articles about the grand opening. It was an extremely popular restaurant. So they ran ads advertising it, articles written about it. They never ran anything negative. It was sued. We'll get into that in a second. They never ran any articles about the lawsuit or anything. It was all very positive. Dinners were called Southern Fried Coon Chicken, Baby Coon Special, Coon Fried Steak. They were sued for libel and defamation of race by the NAACP and the African American newspaper in Seattle. Shortly after they opened. They settled the lawsuit without having to go to court. What would you, now this is in like the 1930s, early 1930s, 1930, 1931. What do you think, what would you guess that they settled the lawsuit suing the Coon Chicken Inn? They settled, so the Coon Chicken Inn did settle. What do you think in 1930 they settled for? $1,000. That's probably a lot of money in 1930. Yeah. Anybody, any other guesses? 1 cent. That's close. 0 cents. This is what they settled for. Change the giant head, the front door, and on the picture on the bottom left is the menu. So that's the way the menu looked. Change those depictions of the coon/porter. The skin on the picture was always black or dark brown. They agreed to change it to blue. I'll let you figure out how that happened because I don't know. And then they had just bought 1,000 spare tire covers for the back of your car, where your spare tires on the back of your car, with the Coon Chicken Inn car covers that had like Coon Chicken Inn and the caricature. They agreed to do away with all those car covers because they were not only going to, they were one of the first restaurants in our country that had a delivery service, and they called it the Coon car. And so they would put it on that car, and then they would sell it to customers so then they could put it on their private car. So they agreed that they would destroy those spare tire covers. You might also be interested in knowing that at that same time, the NAACP and the African American newspaper sued a packaging plant in Seattle called Fresh Products, Inc. They had a peanut product called the 3 little N-words, but all spelled out. And the picture on the wrapping of the can was a peanut shell with 3 little black babies in the peanut shell. This is in the 1930s. So just to give you perspective, think of when you were born, your parents were born, your grandparents were born. My mom was born in 1939. My grandfather was born in 1909. And I knew both of them very well. They were alive during this day. This isn't some faraway slavery time. So because these beliefs that we were trained to have in our country were never addressed, they continued. They continued on. I'm going to read. I always keep pointing at the right. So at several points in the book, Martin Luther King mentions the Birmingham campaign. He mentions the letter from the Birmingham jail. I assume everybody's heard of the letter from the Birmingham jail. But I've heard about the letter from the Birmingham jail as long as I can remember. I won't say my whole life. But I never knew the backstory behind the letter of the Birmingham jail. So if you have the same book as I have, I'm reading from the middle of page 93. Martin Luther King says, "Over the last few years, many Negroes have felt that their most troublesome adversary was not the obvious bigot of the Ku Klux Klan or the John Birch Society, but the white liberal who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers tranquility to equality. In a sense, the white liberal has been victimized with some of the same ambivalence that has been a constant part of our national heritage." So what do you think he means by that? more committed or devoted to order than to justice. What do you think he means by that? Yeah, we'll talk more about this next week, but, during the Freedom Riders that were trying to integrate the buses and the bus terminals, President Kennedy and Attorney General Bobby Kennedy both told people to chill. Not the rioter people, not the people that were attacking the buses, but the Freedom Riders. Now's not a good time, calm down, right? So I'm more concerned with tranquility. I'm more concerned with peace than I am the fact that these folks are getting beaten down and all these other things. So, the Birmingham Campaign. The Birmingham Campaign was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, joined the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, which was led by Fred Shuttlesworth, for a direct action campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, to integrate the businesses, to integrate the city, essentially. It was originally scheduled for March of 1963, but they delayed it because there was a mayoral election that I'm sure everybody's heard of this person, Bull Connor, the director of public safety in Birmingham, Alabama, that used to beat civil rights people, voting rights activists. He was running for mayor against a gentleman named Albert Boutwell, and they felt Albert Boutwell was a lot more moderate than Bull Connor, which was probably everybody under the sun was probably a little more moderate than Bull Connor. And so they delayed their campaign till after the election because they didn't want that to interrupt the, negatively impact the election. So they did. On April 3rd, they started their direct action campaign for civil rights in Birmingham, Alabama. It involved mass meetings, lunch counter sit-ins, marches to City Hall, and a boycott of the downtown merchants. Remember last week we talked about the nonviolent movement was all about bringing people together, right? If you won't talk to us, if you don't work with us to allow us to sit where we want, allow us to shop at this store, allow us to sit at this lunch counter, then we will do like boycott the businesses so you see how much money we bring in, and then you'll come back to the table and we can discuss how we move forward to tomorrow. So on April 10th, the city obtained a state injunction against the protesters, a court order that said that they can't continue protesting. Now, Martin Luther King and the other civil rights activists had a dilemma at this point because they had run out of bail money. So they had collected all this money, and when people would get arrested, they would be able to bail them out. Well, that fund was really low. So they knew if they got arrested, there's a good chance that they would have to stay in jail because they didn't have enough bail money. And so Martin Luther King and others decided, well, it's important enough, so we're going to continue with the protests. So on April 12th, Martin Luther King was violating the court injunction. He was arrested. And on that same day, there was a group of 8 clergymen from Birmingham that wrote a letter that ran in the newspaper that I think Martin Luther King, probably the first time he read it, was in the jail cell. And he wrote his letter in the margins of that newspaper initially. So the 8 clergymen consisted of Episcopal, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Jewish. And these were all considered preachers, pastors, rabbis that supported civil rights. These were all I guess today we'd call them allies, right? People that had publicly stated, things need to change. We can't continue to do this. Yet they wrote this letter. They appealed for law and order and common sense. They said, quote, "We recognize that the natural impatience of people," so the whole civil rights movement was just a thing of impatience, "who feel that their hopes are slow to being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. We commend the community as a whole and the local news media and law enforcement, i.e. Bull Connor, officials in particular, on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. we further strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. What did Martin Luther King say? You're more concerned about order than you are justice. And these were the allies of Martin Luther King. So his letter to from the Birmingham jail was basically to these pastors. And Martin Luther King said this: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Because they kept calling Martin Luther King an outsider, like, you're not from Birmingham, you don't belong here. So his response to that is justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. He went on to say, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I've yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that the justice too long delayed is justice denied. And he ends the letter with, quote, let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Now raise your hand. Well, you don't have to raise your hand if you don't feel comfortable doing it. I'll raise my hand. How many people, here's some pastors that you thought were your friends, that you thought were your allies in this fight where you're putting literally your life on the line to bring, I can just sit at this lunch counter. I can sit in this seat on the bus. Just basic, everyday stuff you're fighting for. And they tell you you're an outsider, go away. How many people would be pissed off and come back at them hard just the way they came at him? Doesn't sound like that's what he did, right? He says, hopefully one day, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. How many people would say, this nation sucks? This nation is horrible. That's not what Martin Luther King did. He's basically like, we're going to be here. So we want to be able to be here together, right? So today I see a lot of times that's not what we do. Okay, so last passage I want to read before we get to the next slide and a quick video and then to the tabletop is on page 126. Many whites who oppose open housing would deny they are racist. They turn to sociological arguments, the crime rate in the Negro community, the lagging cultural standards, the fear that their schools will become academically inferior, the fear that property values will depreciate. In order to find excuses for their opposition, they never stop to realize the criminal responses are environmental, not racial. To hem a people up in prison walls of overcrowded ghettos and to confine them in rat-infested slums is to breed crime. Whatever the racial group may be, it is strange and twisted logic to use tragic results of segregation as an argument for its continuation. So it's been my experience in what I did for a living is that it's not just the people that don't live in the ghettos that believe this, it's also the people that live in the ghettos. Right? When I talk to people in neighborhoods like I grew up in, the response I typically get is that's just the way it is. Right? Like Del Paso Heights, that's just Del Paso Heights. We've resigned ourselves that that's the way it's going to be. Growing up, I did not know the history. I thought I did know, but I clearly didn't know the history of Oak Park. I just assumed that Oak Park had always been like that. I loved Oak Park. I had a blast growing up in Oak Park. Some of my neighbors might not have had a blast of me growing up in Oak Park. But I always thought it was clear that there was violence in my neighborhood. It was clear that there was drugs in my neighborhood. It was clear that there were single-parent homes in my neighborhood, including mine. I just assumed it had always been like that. And so, therefore, I assumed it will always be like that. It wasn't until like 10 years ago when I researched my neighborhood that I realized Oak Park used to be a thriving neighborhood, well off economically. It was the first suburb of Sacramento. And the decisions that were made that removed the economic vitality. I didn't even know the State Fair was in Oak Park. And I grew up probably 10 blocks from the fairgrounds. Now, I came after the fairgrounds left, because I came in the 70s. I didn't even know that. And I grew up in that neighborhood. And so when you talk to people in the neighborhood, it's just, we've resigned ourselves too. That's just the way this neighborhood is, right? And we've been led to believe that those things. So I'll get into that. I thought I got into it last week. So I want to go over a couple of things of what this results in our town. So he talked about confining people in the prisons of a ghetto, and that poverty breeds crime, et cetera, et cetera. So Sacramento was redlined just like every other neighborhood. There was a huge influx of minority families, especially during World War II, because we had 2 military bases and minority families could get jobs at those bases. We had a huge cannery system in Sacramento. A lot of Hispanic families worked in the canneries. I think about 60 or 70% of the cannery workers during World War II were Hispanic. Because we lacked workers to work in the canneries during World War II. Why is that? Why do you think we lacked workers all of a sudden in World War II? Who did we lock up during World War II? Japanese, right? So now we don't have workers. So the Bracero Act and a few things brought Hispanic families to Sacramento, and a lot of them worked in the canneries. But they could not live anywhere they wanted. Land Park, River Park, Curtis Park. Well, Curtis Park wasn't really Curtis Park the way we know it today. East Sacramento were all segregated communities. You could not live there if you were a minority family. The primary redlined area that minority families could live in was called the West End. It was west of the Capitol to the river, from like K Street to about N Street. The largest population of Japanese American families on the West Coast lived right here in the West End in Japantown. Hispanic families, black families, all lived in the West End because they could not live in other neighborhoods. Some people think Oak Park was redlined and the Heights was redlined. They were not. They were yellow, so they could be a mixture. And then we went through this period of urban renewal. So to give you an example of what redlining did, from about 1938 to about 1949, that about decade in there, housing prices in Sacramento went up about 46% on average. So if you owned a house in Sacramento, your value went up about 46%. And a lot of people sent their kids to college based on their home, right? Their money they could pull out of their home and fund their kids' college. People who made money largely made it on owning property. The West End, the redlined area in our town during that exact same period where houses in general went up 46%, the West End redlined neighborhood houses went down 30% in value. So you have whole groups of people that have no ability to gain generational wealth, to fund kids to college and those sort of things because of housing segregation that was driven by the real estate industry primarily. So you see the picture at the top right, that's the picture of Sacramento. The center red square kind of on the left side, that's the West End. So during urban renewal, the federal government provided some funding to cities around the country to redo their slums. And these neighborhoods became run down because in order to survive, a lot of families moved multiple families into a single family home. So essentially, these neighborhoods had way more people than what they were built to sustain. The banks wouldn't provide loans. The bank wouldn't provide home improvement loans. So neighborhoods started to become run down. And so initially they were supposed to rebuild housing in these neighborhoods. But then a few years later, the federal government changed the rules to where you could build other stuff. And so what you see in the West End now, all the buildings, the state offices, the business offices, 20 stories, 25 stories, that's what came during urban renewal in the late 50s and early 60s. And we kicked everybody out. So a lot of the Japanese families moved to like Riverside and Broadway, 10th and W area. If you drive there now, you can still see a lot of signs. Japanese signs kind of thing. And the black families really could only move to either Del Paso Heights or Oak Park. And at that time, the white families were moving out of Oak Park. The businesses were going away. We built Highway 99 to drive people to the newly built West End because we were the first city in the country to use tax increment financing, which meant the taxes you paid in the West End stayed in the West End. They didn't get spread throughout the city. So we wanted to drive people there. Same thing happened in Del Paso Heights. Del Paso Boulevard used to be the most traveled interstate or the second highest trafficked interstate in the state. Because if you were going to go to the mountains, you had to drive down Del Paso Boulevard. And if you talk to people that lived in Del Paso Heights, that are probably 70 plus years old, they will tell you Del Paso Boulevard was the spot to be. It had everything, movie theaters, ice rinks, place to be. Drive down Del Paso Boulevard today and see if you think that matches, right? Because we built Highway 160 shortly before we built Arden Fair Mall to get people to Arden Fair Mall, which killed Del Paso Boulevard. Highway 99 killed Stockton Boulevard, Broadway, and what was called the second downtown on 35th Street, where people would go shopping. All the businesses went away, all the jobs went away, all the economic vitality went away, all the middle-class people moved out to the suburbs, all the minority families moved in because we just kicked them out of the red-lined area, and thus we had the Oak Park that I grew up in. But if you talk to people about these neighborhoods, what I always got, I never got anything different. Why are these neighborhoods the way they are? A very people-centered answer. No daddies in the house. That's why that neighborhood's like that. Those people that live there don't like to work. Those people that live there are violent. Those people, blah, 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 blah. When the reality is those neighborhoods are not like that. That might be true. There might be some families that don't have fathers. There might be some people that commit crimes in there just like other neighborhoods. But the reason the neighborhoods are like that is exactly what Martin Luther King said. We created those neighborhoods, and then crime came because poverty is a big influencer on crime. So you might be surprised to know this. In 1964, I won't ask to raise hands who was alive in 1964, but people like Greg was alive in 1964. In 1964, we had Prop 14 put on the ballot. It was the result of a year earlier Rumford Act, where it said that you could not discriminate when it came to housing based on race, religion, and a few other things, meaning you can't deny rent to somebody because they were Chinese or black. You can't deny selling your house to somebody because of their religion, because they're Catholic or something like that. So the real estate agents didn't like that because they were big proponents of redlining and blockbusting and all those things. So they funded and put forward Prop 14. Prop 14 said you could discriminate based on those things. And so it passed by 65.39% in the state of California that said discrimination based on race, religion, those things is legal. 4.3 million people supported that. 2.3 million voted against it. Here's Sacramento County. We approved it by 61.6%. In 1964. So these beliefs that it's okay to discriminate based on race and religion and those things, we approved it by 60. When's the last time you saw an election was 60+%? It's a landslide if it's 53%. This was 61%. So the gentleman on the left is somebody I think we should all talk about more, is Nathaniel Cawley, the first African-American attorney in Sacramento. He fought Prop 14 all the way to the California Supreme Court. He's part of a larger team that fought it. And eventually they ruled that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. And so they did away with Prop 14. But that was in the 60s. So my brother and sister were alive when we by 61% said it's okay to discriminate. So when we talk about who has money, whose kids go to school, a lot of that is based on who can afford to go to school, where can you live, how much value is your house, did it gain value, did it lose value? And those are things that were out of control of people at that time. It was solely based on their race or their religion or other factors that prevented them from taking part fully in the system. So I wanted to play a quick video, and I had two videos, but this one's specifically on Sacramento that goes into really what Martin Luther King is talking about fencing people in certain areas, where he's talking about it's an environment thing, not a race thing.
The neighborhoods where we grow up can determine the trajectory of our lives, from the money we earn to how long we live. And it's not by accident. America was built this way. And Jesus Hernandez has mapped those inequalities block by block.
I was able to measure every social ill in the city.
Like what?
Where are your dropouts from high school? Where are the people who get the flu? Where are the people who use more water than others?
His work has shown that all of it connects back to one factor over and over again, and that factor is race.
You have these racial patterns that represent a geography of where we shifted our people over the period of 100 years in the developing of the city. And we can pretty much do this in every city in the United States.
Why? Well, about a century ago, legal language was often written into the deeds of houses, prohibiting selling them to people who weren't white. They were called race covenants, and they built racism into the housing system across the country.
White neighborhoods wound up with advantages that still shape modern cities.
We met Hernandez in Sacramento, Land Park to be exact, one of the city's oldest and wealthiest neighborhoods.
And this was one of the areas when it first started developing where race covenants were first used in Sacramento. And so this is where you start seeing this divide between neighborhoods start to happen.
A neighborhood like this one enjoys all the benefits of a century of preferential treatment and public investment. It gets a light rail service. Businesses choose to relocate here. It has bike lanes, bus service, everything that a city dweller would want.
Let's compare two neighborhoods just 3 miles apart. This is Land Park. This is South City Farms. 77.3% of people living in Land Park are white. In South City Farms, 8% are white, 52% are Latino, and 9% are black. 40% of people in Land Park have at least a 4-year degree. In fact, 28% have a master's degree or higher. In South City Farms, only 2.3% graduated from college. In Land Park, 71% of people own their home. In South City Farms, only 25% do. A person living in Land Park is likely to live 10 years longer than someone living in South City Farms. And while average household income in Land Park is over $132,000 a year, in South City Farms, it's just $28,000.
Tell me about this neighborhood in contrast to the other one we saw.
So what you see here is that concentration of race and poverty and every other social ill that you see that's associated with divestment.
You may think to yourself, sure, good and bad neighborhoods, so what? Well, again, it's not coincidence. If you look at the race covenant neighborhoods across Sacramento or any city, the pattern is shocking. In these neighborhoods of Sacramento, education, home ownership, health are all different than these neighborhoods. What's the difference? Well, these neighborhoods were exclusive to whites under race covenants from at least 1913 to 1948 when the covenants became illegal. And banks and lenders used the race of non-white owners to downgrade home values until 1978. That means all that time, white neighborhoods accumulated wealth, political clout, public investment, while other neighborhoods, which also paid their share of taxes, received little or no investment. They even lost money.
Other systems deepened the divide.
The Federal Housing Administration, which was created to make home loans affordable after the Great Depression, refused to back them in African American neighborhoods, a policy called redlining. And while the GI Bill helped white Americans get low-interest mortgages, it shut out African American vets.
Now you see these people here that have to leave the neighborhood for better resources rather than stay here. And when they leave the neighborhood, they actually take their checkbook with them. When they go by in another neighborhood, when they go to get health care in another neighborhood, when they go to school in another neighborhood.
Because they don't have any of those things here. They can't
Correct.
walk here to a grocery store, a school, a hospital.
That's exactly right.
When a neighborhood has had so little money for so long, it takes superhuman effort to provide what the community needs. The city closed this elementary school in 2013. It's now home to a nonprofit called La Familia, run by Rachel Rios.
So when you look at what healthy communities look like, you look at the support services that families can go to, libraries, public transportation, parks, beautiful trees. And when you look at our community, you don't see that. You don't see an investment. You see nonprofits trying to fill in the gap as best we can.
So you provide the only play field in this whole neighborhood.
Yeah, there's not a park here, so this is it.
Racism is not just about our individual attitudes. It's built into our systems.
It's not as blatant as I'm going to oppress this community. It's more subtle than that, and that's the problem with it, is that it is more subtle, and we seem to accept it because it is subtle. So how is it that this community doesn't deserve to have the bus stop? How is it that this community doesn't deserve to have a park? That's where the systemic racism comes into place.
So how do we change nearly a century of inequality? This is not a problem the people of a neighborhood can change on their own, Hernandez says.
You have to directly intervene in the mechanisms that create this inequality.
You have to put your thumb on the scale in some way and change
You have to put your
it.
stick in the spokes and stop that bicycle from moving. And if you don't do that, that racial spatial wealth gap will continue to widen.
And neighborhoods like this continue to get left behind.
Correct.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel.
You can still see this today. If you look at zoning rules throughout our city and probably every city in our country, some neighborhoods you can have duplexes, fourplexes, apartment complexes. Some neighborhoods you can't. Some neighborhoods you can have liquor stores and gas stations and things like that. Some neighborhoods you can't. The council here, I don't know, I'd lose track of my years, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, just changed.
The neighborhoods where we grow up.
I might have just given my next question away there. The city council here in Sacramento just approved Land Park to build, I think, duplexes in Land Park. That was a violation of their zoning. And some in Land Park were adamantly opposed to that, saying it would lower their home values if duplexes were allowed to be built. But some neighborhoods, there's duplexes everywhere. So you can still see these disparities based on our belief system from a long time ago. Okay, so who can tell me, erase what you just saw 2 seconds ago up on that screen, if you caught it. Who can tell me what the #1 sitcom on television was during the early to middle 70s? See that? Y'all cheated. Oh, you knew? Okay. And who was the main character? And what stood out about Archie Bunker? He had some issues, right? Okay, so I'm going to warn you, this video is like a minute and a half long, but it has some pretty out there language. Not cuss words, but racial slurs. So if that's something that you're not ready for right now, just step out for like 2 minutes and then come back. But it was the #1 show in our country from about 1971 to about 1977, which to me wasn't that long ago. And one of the reasons it became such a well-known show is it tackled controversial issues in our country, homosexuality and many other things, including housing segregation. And you'll see that in this episode, that's what they're tackling. And at the end, I won't say age, I'll have another question for you to see how experienced you are.
Gloria, believe me, you'll get to love this.
Well, put it down somewhere and let's see how it looks.
All right, let's try the TV.
All right. I'll move this thing.
Okay. Huh? What do you think?
I don't know.
What do you mean you don't know? That's truth staring you right in the face. Can't you see that?
I'm sorry.
Look, it's all there. The total condemnation of a plastic society. Man's inhumanity to man, and the hope for a new brotherhood shining through.
Where?
Where? There! It's all there! It's the overall effect. That's totally unique.
I guess so. I'm glad now we didn't get the green one.
Oh, I didn't know you kids was back.
Hi, Ma. Look what we rented from the museum.
Oh, my. Ain't that nice?
I'm glad that you're all here, all of us together. Because we got a little important talking to do.
Did you see Jim Bowman?
I certainly did, Edith, and wait till you hear what he done to us.
What has he done to you?
Not only me, to you, to her, to the whole neighborhood, Edith. Jim Bowman sold his home to a family of spades.
Oh, my. As if they didn't have enough problems being Jewish.
It ain't their problem, it's our problem. These people are stepping up in life and we're moving down. How much you think our property's gonna be worth with them living 2 doors away?
Probably more than it was worth before.
Oh, listen to Mr. Real Estate himself. He's gonna tell me about land values now. He can't afford enough to buy enough land to put in a flower pot.
Archie, they've done sociological studies on this thing.
Sociological studies, there he goes again.
Yes, that's right. And they've shown that the social economic class of the first black people moving into a white neighborhood is usually higher than that of the original inhabitants. Therefore, the land values go up.
Does anybody know what the hell he's talking about?
Don't be upset, Daddy. Why, the answers are all right here in this sculpture. Take, for instance, what this represents. This here is the struggle of the races, man's inhumanity to man. Yet through it all, the shining hope of a new brotherhood, see?
The girl has gone basic. I'm all alone here. I'm all alone in this house. Isn't anybody else interested in upholding standards? Our world is coming crumbling down. The coons are coming.
Archie, 12% of the population is black. There should be a lot of black families living out here.
Yeah, this is only a beginning, but I think it's wonderful.
Wonderful, huh? Well, let's see how wonderful it is when a watermelon rinds come flying out the window.
Okay, we even threw Jewish in there just for good measure. If this was on the #1 show, it should tell us how even prominent this stuff, housing and all that stuff, was still in the 70s. And how it's still, like, if you look at these neighborhoods today, they still have challenges. And they were created because of the things that we did, that our leadership did, the decisions that we made. So here's another question on how experienced you guys are. What family is he talking about that moved? The Jeffersons, right? For those of you who don't know, another sitcom spun off. That had some race involved in it too. George Jefferson didn't like who? Now here's the harder question. Let's see if anybody got that. The mom of George Jefferson's son's fiance, or well, I guess eventually they did get married on the show. The mom who was married to, I can't remember his name, Tom, who was white. She was black. He was white. In real life, who is her son? Oh, look at y'all. Guys, okay. All right. Okay, we're going to close on our tabletop exercise. But just think, He talked about when the Jeffersons moved in, our home value is going to go down. That's like a term for that is blockbusting, right? Real estate agents would walk around, look, that minority family moved in, your house is going to go down. How about we sell your house and I'll help you buy a new house out in the suburb, white flight, right? And Martin Luther King talks about we are more concerned with our finances than we are for equality. That's exactly what he's talking about. Right? Like, oh, I like everybody, but they can't move in my neighborhood because my house value is going to go down. All right, so on page 106, I think it's 106, yes. So the tabletop discussions. Martin Luther King on page 106 says, but unenforceable obligations are beyond the reach of laws and society. They concern, he's talking about unenforceable obligations as opposed to enforceable. We talked about this last week. Enforceable are like laws, speeding, burglary, those things. Those are enforceable. We can catch you, we can arrest you, you can have consequences. He's now talking about unenforceable. But unenforceable obligations are beyond the reach of laws of society. They concern inner attitudes, expressions of compassion, which law books cannot regulate and jails cannot rectify. Such obligations are met by one's commitment to an inner law, a law written on the heart. Man-made laws assure justice, but higher law produces love. No code of conduct ever compelled a father to love his children or a husband to show affection to his wife. The law court may force him to provide bread for the family, but it cannot make him provide the bread of love. A good father is obedient to the unenforceable. The ultimate solution to the race problem lies in the willingness of men to obey the unenforceable. So, at your tables, 2 questions to discuss. The first one, what can we, you, the church, do to move in the direction for all to obey or to move in that direction, the unenforceable, right? We don't have the power that if somebody doesn't obey the unenforceable that we arrest them, right? So we have to get there some other way. The second question, on 104, he talks about, on page 104, he talks about freedom. What does freedom mean? And he talks about freedom is the capacity to weigh alternatives, make decisions, and have responsibility. So the first question is, what can we do to move in the direction for all to obey the unenforceable or more to obey the unenforceable? Probably never get to 100%. And the second question, what does it mean today? So what Martin Luther King was dealing with is a little different than what we are. There's a lot of similarities, but we have more rights now than we had in general than we had during the 60s. What does it mean today to be free? Like if somebody was asking you, what does that mean to be free? What would your answer be? And are all people in our community free? And I'll add something if you have time. If not, what do we do to help all people be free? All right, any questions on that? All right, so discuss those 2 questions at your table. Then we'll do a quick report out, and then, I have a song at the end, so on our way out. Okay, let's wrap it up so we can get you all home. Who wants to volunteer on some of your discussion on the first question? What can we do to move in the direction to obey what Martin Luther King called the unenforceable obligations? Any volunteers? Yes, in the back table.
Hold it.
Okay.
We talked largely about education. It was a conversation, but just in the book, how Martin Luther King talks about there's so much that specifically our, both, but like specifically our white brothers and sisters don't know about their own history, and how that really holds everyone in bondage of not, like, if you don't know or if you're not willing to face the history of, like, yeah, your people did some things that were really not okay, and like how how do we now rectify that as a unit? And like the prodigal son thing that he brings up, like how as Black and brown people do we be the accepting, like how are we going to stand with open arms? Like there has to be some level of trust, which is hard. But yeah, just the education of like, well, if you understood where your background is as a white person, and I'm Black and white, so I'm like speaking literally from both sides right now, but if you understood where your history comes from and like some of the real like evils that have been committed by your side of history, that gives a very different perspective on where you are, rather than just believing that, oh, like, you know, I'm the white supremacy part of like, well, like we're, you know, racially superior, and so we have all these things because of all these great privileges that we have, and or not privileges, but because of all the character pieces.
Yeah,
that
I would
make
even
us
expand that. I don't. Most of us don't know our history, like, because if you know how we've been taught history, there's a lot of stuff left out or modified or, you know, different things. So most of us don't know all of our history. So yeah, who else? And back.
See, bro knows how to wait for me to run.
Learn to wait. Yeah, you just inspired me to share, not what I shared at the table here, but the whole idea of learning your history. It can be one of the things that can enter into a space where the unenforceable can become forcible. One example, my son bought a home in Arden
Arcade?
Arden Arcade, yes. And the realtor at first did not want to explain why the CCRs, what she got, talked about redlining. And she did not want to go there. And she's one of those progressive realtors out of Oak Park, you know? And so I was going to say something, but my son forced her to have this conversation and explain that history part. And the next thing you know, he's wanting to move into Arden
Arcade
because part of it is because of this it just awoke something in his heart that he could be part of positive change. But he was kind of disappointed. There aren't really a lot of Archie Bunker races left, and but anyways, it has stayed. It has stayed a mission of his. Yeah.
Yes, good. Anybody else on the first question? Yes, in the middle.
I think on page 62, where Martin talks about the guilt-ridden white minority who fears that that if the Negroes obtain power, they'll essentially come after them. And I think Baldwin's letter to his nephew is very powerful, because he tells him that you must accept them. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And, you know, that kind of addresses white guilt and things of that nature. And, I'm not going to, read it all, but on page 62, his letter to his nephew is very powerful.
Okay, anybody on the second question? What does it mean to be free today? And are all people free? Is there a hand up here? Oh, Jerry.
You're deferring.
Oh, I thought I saw a hand up here.
Okay, I can go. So for me, to me, freedom really means just having the ability to have options and have equal access and opportunity to really be yourself, to grow and to foster who you truly are meant to be in society. And I don't think we are, all people in our community are free. And I say this in my own personal example. So in high school, I completed a CTE program, which is Career Technical Education. So I had the opportunity before I even graduated high school to be a certified medical assistant, which really jump-started my career in the healthcare industry. But I realized a lot of other schools didn't have that opportunity, so I was privileged to be able to do that. I was also privileged in the fact that I had transportation to participate in that program, because other students at my school, they may have wanted to participate, but they're like, how you get into this other school that's offering the program? If you can't get there, you can't participate. So to me, I realized that I've been privileged in a lot of ways that other people may not have had that opportunity, and that's not freedom if we all did not have that equal and fair opportunity to participate in those types of programs.
And education's often been referred to as like one of the equalizers, and as we saw last session, education has, for a long time, had some disparities like that. Absolutely, yes.
So at our table, we talked about a lot of different multifaceted factors on what is free. Everyone has a different type of free. Based on, we talked about the homeless, how they felt they're free because they don't have to be part of society, being responsible for paying taxes. And I think it's an individual decision of what you feel to be makes you feel free.
So maybe the true freedom in what you're talking about is you're able to make that decision as opposed to somebody making it for you.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
All right. I'm probably going to say this a little different than what I said at the table, but unenforceable, to be unenforceable and to do what it means to be free are synonymous to me in a way, in the sense that Christ so loved, and if that's the highest form, then we have an opportunity to experience that here. There was nobody more free than Christ. Whatever came at him, he was still free.
Interesting,
And I think when we talk about what happened last week with the Black Panthers, I think that was a great movement and a great thing, and Martin wasn't quite going that way. He wasn't going that way because he understood freedom. He knew where the freedom lied. He knew the freedom lied in the principles, not in the facts. The fact is, we're black, but the truth is, we're God's kids. And that's a difference. If we can walk in the truth, not the facts, I think we have a chance to deal with unenforceable and also freedom.
Awesome point. Very good, yes. So thank you all. I think what we'll do now is James will come up to close us up. I have a song, but I think we'll play that at the very end as you guys are leaving. If you want to stay for the song, that's cool since we're running over. But we'll close out with James.
I love that, Jerry. Freedom not to do what we want, but freedom to do whatever God's called us to do. So I really hope that in the context of a believer that we really do leverage our resources and our privileges for the benefit of others. As we wrap up, just two quick announcements. In the month of March, we're starting 2 new series. So 2 studies. One is going to be prophecy. What will the future look like according to the Bible? Pastor Rich will teach that on Tuesdays starting in March. Second, we're going to have a Come to the Table, a racial reconciliation journey. Ms. Renette, you know about that. We're going to start that on Mondays starting March 10th for 5 weeks. So if you're interested, go online and register for those 2 events. Last question I want to leave you with before you go is food for thought. What would the church look like if everyone was just like you? Imagine if everyone gave like you. Imagine if everyone served and prayed like you. Imagine if everyone read their Bible like you, spent their time with God like you. Would the church be healthy and empowered? Or would it be weak and lacking? So join me in prayer. Father, we just lift this up to you, God. Thank you for any words of wisdom that you've given us tonight. And I pray that whatever we have learned, we may actually apply it. We thank you, God. We thank you, we thank you, we thank you for freedom found in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Okay, on your way out, I'm going to play a song. I'm sure you've probably heard the name of this song, but the reason I play it is because you get the sense of how desperate people were during this time. This is Billie Holiday's "Strange Fruit," which she was banned from doing in a lot of places. It was originally a poem composed by Abel Meeropol. So I'll just play it. If you're walking out while you're listening to it, that's cool.
And now a little tune written especially for me, "Strange Fruit." Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.